So all of you are experts in language, and language is absolutely critical to communication. But cultural understanding and historical understanding are extremely important too, particularly for your corporate clients. Our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, was once criticized heavily in the Chinese press with a headline in an editorial saying to speak Chinese is not to understand China. That can be, that's a very important issue for people to understand. This isn't unique to China, but it is a particular issue when dealing with China because there are historical and cultural issues that can cause companies to run into terrible trouble. So if you do offend China, whether you're offending its government or its people, this can have terrible consequences. You might lose government contracts, you might face consumer boycotts. Increasingly, you can face official and unofficial blockades of your products, or you can have to go through a very costly rebranding process. There are lots of ways that you can run into trouble through offending China. Sometimes it can be your fault. Sometimes, and I say this particularly speaking from Australia, it can be your government's fault. It can be your government's fault that you got caught doing something you shouldn't, or it can just be that you get taken completely out of context. There are a lot of historical factors behind China's sensitivity. There are loads of different areas that I could discuss, but because I'm going to look at this at some point from an Australian perspective, I'm going to focus on this one. If you don't understand China, there's every risk that you could say the wrong thing at some point. Socially, that's fine. You know, people expect you to get things wrong. But professionally, in your marketing materials, in your corporate communications, it really isn't. So yeah, the issue I'm going to deal with here is the Opium Wars. There were two, both in the mid-19th century. They were the first major modern interactions between China and foreign powers, and they were a humiliation for China. China was forced to cede Hong Kong to the British, and later to open treaty ports, something you can still see today when you cycle through Shanghai or Tianjin. Actually, don't cycle through Shanghai, you'll get run over. But you can see the different architecture from the different countries who controlled parts of the treaty ports. It was forced to open its markets, which wouldn't be such a bad thing, but it was primarily to opium, which was a bad thing. Under very unfavorable terms. All of this really weakened China. The Qing dynasty hadn't been doing great anyway, but the Opium Wars were really the final straw. And so for that second half of the 19th century, following the Opium Wars, China was racked by civil unrest and economic disaster. The empire finally fell in 1911. And the Republic of China was proclaimed. The next 38 years saw civil war, exploitation by foreign powers, and later occupation of large parts of China by Japan. Even when China did finally get reunited in 1949 under the People's Republic of China, it wasn't completely whole. The existence of Hong Kong, controlled by the British, and Macau, controlled by the Portuguese, was still seen as a national humiliation until the end of the 20th century. And the continuation of the Republic of China on Taiwan is still an embarrassment for the Communist Party and something they're very sensitive about. Before the Opium Wars, China had the biggest economy in the world, but since then it's had 150 years of poverty and humiliation. It's only been in the last 30, 40 years that it started to regain its position. And these are issues that we really need to tiptoe around. China can be, the Chinese government and mass media and mass social movements can be very sensitive about anything that refers back to this humiliation. So comments that might be seen as okay about another country can be a disaster for a corporation in China. So first of all, I mentioned problems that can be your fault. The most obvious examples of these would be offensive advertising campaigns. So in 2018, Dolce & Gabbana ran this comedy advert where a Chinese model tried to eat Western food with chopsticks, and a narrator on the advert mispronounced the Dolce & Gabbana name. It was stupid, a horrible advert. And there were allegations of racism made against Stefano Gabbana, which made things even worse. This was totally Dolce & Gabbana's fault. There was a very predictable backlash in mainland China and in Hong Kong. Protests outside of D&G shops. The fashion show had to get cancelled. It cancelled its ad campaign. One of its leading Chinese brand ambassadors left the company, and it lost significant sales. So this was an occasion, and we've seen it in other cases, but D&G is probably the best example of just not thinking things through and frankly having a bloody stupid idea in the first place. This was offensive, and it wouldn't have gone down well in any country. But there are other cases where you can run an offensive ad campaign without having any idea that it could be offensive. One of the best examples of this was the Philips Genie mobile phone. I don't know if you'll remember it. Some of you are probably too young. It was a very small phone, an old-fashioned candy bar one. It was launched in 1999. And Philips launched this huge global advertising campaign. It all focused on big people being next to little monuments. So there was this giant woman leaning on the Eiffel Tower and making a phone call. And that was no problem. There was a giant man leaning on the Leaning Tower of Pisa making a phone call. Again, that was no problem. But when a giant white man sat on the Great Wall like it was a bench, he made a phone call, and this caused outrage in China. It seems to have been started by a nationalist, officially non-government organization. But they said that sitting on the Great Wall showed a lack of respect for the Great Wall itself, and thus a lack of respect for China. It was never meant to be that way by Philips. And they never had any problems with France or Italy or any of the other countries where they ran this. But because there was this organization behind the demonstrations, there were demonstrations outside Philips China offices. There was a huge consumer boycott. And this happened before social media, before it was easy to kick off something like this. Philips had to apologize and withdraw the adverts. And it had to launch a whole new global campaign for that phone. I've been searching for ages, because I use this as a good case study, for pictures of those adverts, and there are none that I can find on the internet. That's how bad it went, and how much effort Philips had to put into eradicating the problem. I'm now going to talk about Taiwan. I shall do so very carefully. It's critical for your clients to never say or even suggest that Taiwan is not part of China. Many of you, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, you're very familiar with this, but your clients may not be. And explaining briefly to them what the situation is can be extremely helpful. So through the 1930s and 1940s, even when they were both fighting the Japanese, the nationalist Kuomintang and the Communist Party were fighting each other in a civil war. Fighting ended in 1949, and the Kuomintang withdrew to Taiwan. Both the Kuomintang, who are now the opposition party in Taiwan, and the Communist Party say there is one China and that Taiwan is part of that country. The Kuomintang says that one China is the Republic of China, founded in 1911 and run by them. The Communist Party says that the one China is the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949. You must never get the ROC and the PRC confused. That's a catastrophe. And you must never say that Taiwan is not part of China. Never call it a country, because mainland China will always see that as an insult. Beijing sees Taiwan as a renegade province. You should never leave Taiwan off of a map of China. It's a very common thing that happens. I used to work at an American law firm in Hong Kong. We had a publication which had just a silhouette map of China, and it didn't have Taiwan on it. We had to pulp thousands of issues of the magazine and reprint them with Taiwan on them. And while we're at it, I've mentioned be careful about the 11- line. I don't know if you can see my mouse here. It's sometimes called the 9- line, but it follows this route, encompassing Taiwan and also the South China Sea. That's because China claims the South China Sea, as you'll have seen in the news. It's important to include that in any map as well. Otherwise, you can run into trouble. Suggesting that Taiwan is not part of China can cause a lot of problems for corporations. Sometimes it can be relatively minor. Qantas is a good example of this. In 2018, Qantas was one of 36 airlines which was told by the Cyber Administration of China to stop calling Taiwan a country on its website. On your pull-down menu of which country you want to travel to or which country you're from, it listed Taiwan separately from China. Qantas agreed to stop doing this and was given an extension to the deadline to do it. But they still had to spend time and money to change their website, something that they never should have had to do. They shouldn't have got themselves into this situation. A worse example would be Marriott. In 2018, they sent out a questionnaire to clients. It referred to Taiwan as a separate country, but also Hong Kong, Macau, and even Tibet. This was heavily criticized by the Chinese government. The Cyberspace Administration said that Marriott had seriously violated national laws and hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. That's a term that's used a lot by Chinese government departments when they're dealing with this kind of issue. Marriott had to apologize. It had to shut down its website in China for a week, missing out on lots of bookings, and it had to publicly condemn separatists in Hong Kong and in Tibet. That caused problems in other markets. It's similar to the issues that we've seen, for example, with some NBA teams. Saying that Taiwan or Tibet or somewhere like that is separate to the rest of China causes problems in China, but saying that they're not causes problems in the rest of the world. It's an issue that your clients really have to tiptoe around, that they have to understand, and that they just have to be extremely careful. One thing that we see quite often in the case of Qantas and Marriott, we saw government actions against companies. That's one of the things that can happen, but another, when you've offended China in some way, can be media attacks, which are sold as grassroots, that they're not government attacks on your country, on your company, but in reality they kind of are. You've got to remember that Chinese media is mostly state-owned and state-controlled. These attacks are not happening without government support. Two good examples of the kind of things that we've seen are the KFC tainted chicken scandals and the Danone's hospital infant formula bribery scandal. It's something that you have to be very careful about, and you have to be constantly aware that you can run into this kind of problem, into this kind of attack. In both of these cases, it was down to things that the company's governments were doing to a degree, but they both got caught doing things they shouldn't have been doing anyway. So in terms of KFC, this was stuff that took place in, I think, 2015 and 2016. There were trade tensions between China and the US, and several Chinese products had been subject to anti-dumping duties by the US government. Sorry, I need the Coke. It's just gone 6 o'clock in the morning here. KFC was seen as a symbol of America. It always has been within China. And so it was attacked by the Chinese media. What happened was there was an investigative report done by Chinese media reporters. There were several different ones that happened. KFC came under sustained attack during this period. One was over the excessive use of antibiotics in chickens. Chickens at KFC were tested and had huge amounts of antibiotics, which led to them growing extremely quickly. One, and to those about to have dinner, I apologize for this, but was rotten meat being thrown back into supplies and rotten meat used in KFC chickens. And even worse, if it's close to dinner time for you, sick and dead chickens were being bought from farms and sold as fresh meat. This turned out KFC had a supplier who they thought was legitimate, but which was actually two guys in Jiangsu and Zhejiang with a van. They would go around chicken farms and say to the farmers, "Oh, have you got any sick chickens or dead chickens that you need to get away from your healthy ones? We'll take them and for a small fee." So the farmers would pay these guys to take their sick and dead chickens, and then these people would sell those chickens onto KFC. In all of those cases, KFC, the American company that was being attacked, wasn't actually the problem. It was Chinese companies in their supply chain, but it had made a mess of its supply chain management. But KFC was demonized and sales took a big hit. Sales fell by 14% store on store in 2014, just from the rotten meat scandal. There were further falls from the antibiotics and the sick and dead chicken stories. KFC is seen as representing America in a way that other American companies, apart from McDonald's, are not. KFC is often the first company to take a hit when Sino-American relations decline. The Danone story is another example of problems with government, with your government, leading to you being caught doing something you never should have been doing anyway. There was an investigative report on Chinese TV in 2013 showing that Danone sales managers were bribing hospital staff in Tianjin to push new parents not to breastfeed, but to use formula, and not to use any formula, but to use Dumex baby formula. This was common practice across the sector. The Dutch and American and Australian companies were all doing this as well. But only Danone was hit by the scandal. The reason for this was that the Sino-French relations were really bad at the time. The French government had sold arms to Taiwan, which is part of China, and this had caused problems in Sino-French relations. Danone was one of the bigger French players in China, and so it was targeted. CCTV, again, which did the investigative report, is state-owned media. None of this was done without state approval. Sometimes though, and this is something that's particularly valid for Australians at the moment, but which is a key example, I think, for the rest of the world. It's not your company's fault in any way. Danone and KFC were caught doing things they shouldn't have been doing. But Australian companies who've done nothing wrong have found that their exports to China are in free fall and have been over the past year. Our barley exports have dropped to almost zero. Our wine exports have collapsed. Cotton exports have gone to zero. Timber exports have almost stopped. There are ships full of Australian coal which have been sitting off the Chinese coast for months. After COVID, once travel starts again, we'll see severe impacts on education and tourism as well, two of Australia's biggest exports. If the situation doesn't improve, I expect that dairy and wheat could be the next victims of this. And China's even searching for alternative supplies of iron ore. Australia is by far China's biggest supplier of iron ore, and it's our biggest export to China. It also came up this week that Chinese investment to Australia fell by 60% last year. A lot of this has happened because of Australia-China government tensions, which have happened in turn because the Australian government does not understand China. We already had a relationship that was difficult, but it was made much worse in April 2020 by what appears to have been unwitting offence. So we've seen the exports fall for several reasons. In May, an anti-dumping duty of around 80% was imposed on Australian barley. That meant we could no longer compete with American or Ukrainian barley. And American barley has almost totally replaced exports of Australian barley to China. An anti-dumping investigation is being launched into wine. And while it's still got about a year to go, the Ministry of Commerce have launched preemptive provisional duties that you have to pay when you're importing your wine into China, and which may get returned if the investigation finds that you haven't been dumping. This is very unusual, and it shows how severely Australian companies are being treated. The government has informally told Chinese cotton importers to stop buying Australian cotton, and they have. Exports of timber from Tasmania and Queensland have dropped to almost zero because of warnings about timber being infested with pests. These warnings don't appear to be true, which is an important issue. And we saw similar issues with coal. A lot of those delays through 2020 and earlier as well in early 2019 was that coal was being subject to quality inspections because of allegations of impurities in the coal. Again, these were not true, but they left Australian coal sitting in ports or offshore for so long that it became impossible for Chinese companies to buy Australian coal. More recently, in December and January, Chinese coal importers have been told by the government to stop buying Australian coal. In each of these cases, the Chinese move came in reaction to something the Australian government had done. Initially, we had issues like blocking Chinese access to Australian markets. Banning Huawei from building Australia's 5G network, we were the first country to do so, was what led to the initial anti-dumping investigation on barley. There have been domestic political moves about foreign interference in Australian politics, which have been widely seen as anti-China. The cotton restrictions and the provisional duties on wine were imposed after Australia engaged in military maneuvers with India, the US, and Japan, which were seen as anti-China. And there have been other factors too. But the single most important issue, the thing that's led to all of this escalation, was one Australian government move that was a result of a total misunderstanding of China. In April 2020, as the COVID crisis was just beginning, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an investigation team with weapons inspector style powers to go into China and to run a hostile investigation searching for the origins of COVID-19. Everyone wanted an investigation of some sort to find out what had happened, even China did. But Australia was the only country that called for these weapons inspector style powers. In any country, this would have been seen as crass and insensitive. But in China, it goes back to our conversation earlier about the Opium Wars, and particularly about something called extraterritoriality. After the Opium Wars, one of the terms of settlement involved extraterritoriality. That meant that people from certain foreign powers, such as Britain and France, were not subject to Chinese law when they were in China, but subject to their own laws. So Chinese law did not extend to foreign people in China. This was a huge humiliation for China, and one of the things that really damaged the Qing dynasty. Chinese governments, all the past dynasties, have relied on something called the mandate of heaven. This is the idea that God wants you to be running the country, or the gods. And it's when you lose the mandate of heaven that you that there's a movement against you and you get overthrown. This is what has happened throughout history. And extraterritoriality in particular was one of the reasons that the Qing dynasty was seen as losing its mandate of heaven, leading to the revolution. So Australia's move brought back this extraterritoriality. It was seen within many people in the government in China as a threat to Chinese sovereignty, and even a threat to the Communist Party's mandate of heaven, so a threat to the legitimacy of Communist Party rule. Australia didn't understand that it was doing this. Scott Morrison in particular, who understands white, Christian, heterosexual, middle-aged Australian men and no one else, didn't understand that he could be causing offence, and didn't understand what the long-term consequences would be. So what we see now is that other countries criticise China over issues such as Hong Kong and the treatment of Uyghur people in Xinjiang. But their companies don't suffer in the way that Australian companies do. I mentioned before the military manoeuvres that led to sanctions against our cotton and our wine. They were part of an organization called the Quad with India, Japan, and the US. But companies from those countries didn't suffer any consequences, only we did. That's something we see a lot now. If we do anything that's seen as anti-Chinese, Australian companies suffer. But if other countries do it, it's not a problem. There's a bit of shouting from a Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, and that's as far as it goes. That's because we're now in a different position to all other countries. Moves that you can get away with if you're somewhere else are disastrous for Australia. And all of this comes from that call for extraterritorial powers for a COVID-19 investigation team. Australia still doesn't understand the situation. We're still treating the anti-dumping issues and the other trade barriers as a trade issue rather than as a symptom of a geopolitical issue. Our trade minister doesn't understand why his Chinese counterpart won't pick up the phone. And this is all because our government has made no effort to understand China. The misunderstanding goes both ways, and that's an important thing to understand too. The mistrust between the two countries is mutual because many in the Chinese government don't understand Australia. Many don't understand how democracy works. They don't understand what an opposition politician is or what a backbencher is. So a statement by any politician is seen as being a statement by the government. That's an important thing, because many of the things that have been said recently that the Chinese government has taken offense to have been said by backbenchers, minor politicians who are not part of the core of the government. People like Barnaby Joyce, George Christensen, Eric Abetz, who are wildly anti-China, but who are not part of government. People in China, and many government people in China don't understand what was coined in 2000, in the mid-2000s by former Prime Minister John Howard as core and non-core political promises. That can lead to misunderstandings. So Tony Abbott, who went on to be Prime Minister in 2013, in 2012 said that under an Abbott government, no Chinese state-owned enterprise would be allowed to invest in Australia. This wasn't true, and it was a non-core political promise. It was something made for domestic consumption that was never going to happen, and the kind of thing we see in democracies all the time. But it caused a panic among Chinese state-owned enterprises because they didn't understand that this was a non-core promise. There's also a problem of a failure to understand how a free press works. We spoke before about those investigative reports of Danone and KFC being something that was led by the state because we have state-owned media, because China has state-owned media. Because of that, when an independent media organization says something that's seen as anti-China, there's often a failure to understand within the Chinese government that that's being done by an independent media without state encouragement. So for both directions, it really is essential for governments to have experts in place who understand their major strategic partners and the competitors. Australia and China is a good example, but it covers the whole world. And it's important for those governments to listen to those people. So in Australia, there is no longer a good point man, an expert who different government departments can consult on Chinese issues. There used to be, but she's left the civil service. Similarly, in China, there's no Australia expert or group of Australia experts who can be approached by different government departments to understand what's going on. So I think what's happened over the last year shows that other countries can really learn from Australia's mistakes. No one's saying you can't criticize China. Every country should be able to criticize every other country when they feel that they've done something wrong. But governments and companies have to understand China and understand its culture and history. They have to understand what kind of criticisms work and what don't, how you can frame a criticism or a geopolitical move in a way that won't offend China, and what mistakes you could make that can make things go horribly wrong. So thank you for that. I hope it's been helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Steve again said that he has a question for you, so I'll just let him ask it.
Okay.
Hi, Bruce. One of your, that was a very fascinating presentation, a lot of great examples. And we were just commenting in the chat room that we wish we could see the pictures of that ad with the big people with little monuments. Yeah. We're really hoping that we could see that. But my question for you is, you noted in one of your slides that many Australian industries are on the verge or on the brink of collapse, and it's through no fault of their own. And I know, and I certainly agree with that sentiment. You know, it's sort of the doing of the Australian government. I also know that, for example, the wine industry, just take that as an example, grew something like fivefold. I don't have the stats in front of me, but in the last few years, and a lot of that growth came from China alone, right? So, and I believe that exports to China represents something like 90% of the wine exports for Australia. I guess my question is, do you feel that these Australian companies and industries have come to rely too much on China for their growth and sort of putting all of their eggs in one basket? Certainly they didn't do the offending part, but just in terms of their business strategies, whether they've just come to rely on China too much.
That's something that comes up all the time in Australia. Constant complaints by Australian politicians and within the Chinese media saying, why don't we diversify? And the fact of the matter is we've always had highly diversified exports. But the country that is one of the countries that's closest to us, with a quarter of the world's population, now has grown to a point where it is significant. We get told regularly that we rely too much on exports to China. But China is one of the closest countries to Australia. It's a quarter of the world's population, and it accounts for a third of our exports. So that is a long way from over-reliance. We haven't reduced our sales to other countries. This goes for wine, for cotton, for anything else. All we've done is expand our sales to China. So China has led to growth, but it's not led to us abandoning India or Europe or anything like that. It seems inevitable that any country in our position should be exporting that kind of volume to China as it continues to grow. We can go back to our old base, but we can't force the Saudis to start drinking our wine, which was something that when our barley exports were halted, our trade minister said, "Oh, it's all right. We've got a new free trade agreement coming up with Saudi Arabia." Quite what the Saudis were going to do with barley, which is used mostly for brewing beer and feeding pigs, is beyond me. So yeah, we'll continue exporting to all the other countries we export to, but we will lose all of the growth we've made over the last 15 years.
Great, thank you for that. And I know that's just in Taiwan, for example. There's the big news right now in Taiwan is the export of pineapples, from Taiwan to China, right? Which China has just recently banned. Well, actually, I think they levy significant taxes on the import of pineapples. But anyway, that's a fair point.
If Taiwan starts dumping pineapple cake in Australia, I'll be quite happy.
Indeed.